Hey, Jeff here. I have been tying a lot of these flies, this pattern this spring because I've been fishing the white bass run this spring, and I've had tremendous success. I have caught. One day I quit counting at 100. Did I catch 200 fish? Maybe. Did I catch 250 fish? Maybe. They were really just piled up in a small creek, and one cast right after another, and I'm just hauling them in left and right. And I have been doing almost all of this fishing with Skagit heads on single-handed and two-handed rods. I like using sink tips as opposed to heavily weighted flies. I like the way that the sink tips get the fly down without it just plummeting straight to the bottom. And you get a little more action when it's not heavily weighted. I've tied some of these with some bead heads for a friend that has a rod that doesn't have any sink tips or anything like that. So I tied some up with bead heads for him to use, because you do sometimes have to get these down to the fish. Sometimes the white bass are like crazy and will come up to the top and hit them, and other times they need to be down where the fish are, and a lot of times they're hugging the bottom. So I have been using this Echo SR, mostly the 6-weight with the OPST Commando Skagit head and 12-foot long 96 grain sink tips and various sink rates. So the deal with a Skagit head is that it's a super weight forward line, and then it's connected to shooting line, so it's only about 15 feet long. And it's a very, very, very weight forward line that can turn over these sink heads. And then you've got, on that rod, on the 6-weight, I have got just Amnesia as my shooting line. And I can really get it out there. And I've been doing a lot of practicing of the various spay casts and Skagit casts. And I've just got a Scandi head too for later on this summer when I don't need to drag bottom quite so much. So what's this fly that I've been using? Well, I want it to be simple. I want it to be relatively disposable. And I started looking around for patterns. I wanted something that I could swing in the current. So again, not heavily weighted. I don't want to hang it up on bottom. I want it swinging across the current so the fish can see it. And so what I came up with was, I had expected to go steelhead fishing in 2020. Now, for obvious reasons, that didn't happen because there was a COVID epidemic. And, the worst thing that I can say about it is that it caused me to not be able to go steelhead fishing. Well, I'm lucky. But that aside, I was researching steelhead flies, and I came across a pattern on Tim Flagler's Tightline video. You should check it out. Called the White Death. And it's just a very simple little zonker. As tied, it was invented by a guy named Jeff Blood. His are relatively small, size 12, a white zonker strip, and some silvery, I want to call it, it's not quite flat braid, but it's a silvery material, reflective, almost looks like twisted up Flashaboo that you wind up, and then you just put this zonker strip over the top of it, and you end up with something like this, right? So my adaptation of this was, one, make it a little bit bigger, and number two, I'm using chenille for the bodies. I messed around with a bunch of these. I have some that have like flat braid bodies and various and sundry things, and some of them have had flash on them, crystal flash. Some of them had Flashaboo. Some of them had rubber legs. You know what? You don't need any of that. It's just unnecessary. This fly alone, this pattern has caught me hundreds of fish this spring, including some really nice wipers. So let's get started on this. So what hook we're using is the Mustad 9672. It's a streamer hook. It's a 4XL, 2 extra heavy. It's a woolly booger type hook. I'm tying these in size 4 and size 8. I use 4 when the water's kind of murky or for bigger fish, especially the wipers. For when the water's a little clearer, and or they're not being super bitey, because believe it or not, sometimes the white bass do just kind of sit on the bottom and don't want to bite. You have to put the fly right in their face, and then it's a fairly light take. I've been tying some in size 8. So first thing you do, mash that barb. First time you put a clouser in the back of your head with a barb on it, you're going to really wish that you had taken that barb off. I know people think that, like, oh, I can see taking barbs off for trout fishing, but bass fishing, why would I take the barbs off? I'm not finding that I lose any more fish. In fact, I find that I get more hookups with barbless hooks because they penetrate better. So first thing I'm going to do, 2 different colors of thread on 2 separate bobbins. We're going to be using 2 bobbins on 1 fly. So this is something I picked up from Tim Flagler's method of tying that white death fly. So the very first thing I'm going to do is tie in this red thread, and I'm using 2 different colors here, largely so you can see what I'm doing, but I also think maybe having like a little contrasting color spot on the back might, who knows. Fish probably don't care. I care because it looks cool. So what are my other materials? Super simple. Woolly Bugger chenille, Antron chenille. In this case, this is medium fluorescent orange. I'm gonna call this chartreuse, right? It sure looks chartreuse to me. Rabbit Zonkers, fluorescent chartreuse. I have tied this in a whole bunch of different colors, as you can see from the box. But obviously, I think that the chartreuse, as Lefty Cray would say, if it ain't got chartreuse, it ain't no use. So that has seemed to be the #1 most productive color so far. I've tied some up in some a little bit more natural colors for later on this summer. We'll see if those are productive for things like bass and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going to take that chenille and I'm going to tie it in, and I'm going to work it towards the back. Don't have to be super crazy about binding this down. Get right about where you're, right there, right? So it's just about at the bend of the hook. Now I'm going to take this and pull it off to the side. Over here, I'm going to hang it off my adjustment for my rotary feature on this. It seems to function pretty well as a bobbin holder, a backwards bobbin holder. Okay, so then I'm going to take and tie in the second color of thread. And oh, by the way, this is UTC thread. I have 2 different sizes here. I got 140 on the back, and I don't have chartreuse in 140. Right now I used it all up, so I've got a little bit of chartreuse at 70 denier, but I typically use 140. You don't need small, fine thread for this. This is not a dainty little trout fly. All right, so now I'm going to wind this chenille forward. I'm going to stop a little short of the head. Give me some room to tie in that zonker here in a second. So then I'm going to go ahead and cut that off, trim it up. All right. Wind it down just a little bit more. Again, this isn't a trout fly. You don't have to be super crazy about watching your thread wraps on this. All right, so then the next thing I've got is a rabbit zonker, and you can't see this because it's happening off camera, but I'm cutting a point into it. So I'm tapering it down to a point here, and I am going to tie that point in right here at the front. Okay, I'm gonna really wrap that up good. When I very first started this pattern, I wasn't wrapping it enough at the front, and it was coming apart because white bass tend to tear up flies. On the 100 fish day, it didn't matter. The fly could be falling apart, and you could catch plenty. Now I'm gonna give this a little counterclockwise spin, flatten out that thread so you have a nice smooth head. Do the fish care? No, but we care, don't we? Because it looks pretty. And then I'm gonna lip finish this up front. I'm gonna come back later and hit this with some UV resin, because like I said, they tend to tear this thing up. Now, next step is I'm gonna preen this hair forward on the Zonker strip. I'm gonna come back and get my other bobbin. Okay, tighten that up a little bit. I'll stretch this fairly tight. You could put some super glue on top of the chenille and really bind it down in there if you want. I'm not sure that I would mess with it, but if you want a super duper bomb proof fly, you could do that. Then here's the trick of this fly that's so cool, and this would work a lot better if I had a much larger whip finisher, but I don't. I only have this one, so I need to get a bigger one for tying this. But I'm just gonna whip finish this here in the back, tighten it down, cut it off. And when I was doing this earlier, here's one that I used when on, this is actually the one that I used. This was the one that I used on the 100 fish day, and believe it or not, like you can see all the hair has been shredded out of it here at the top, right? I mean, you notice that the tail's kind of long. I've changed that since then. It tends to foul if you leave it longer like that, so I cut it fairly short. So I'm going to come in here about a hook gap-ish in here, kind of preen this up, cut it off. Now that looks really short, but trust me, once you get this thing in the water, this fur will move. Just, you know, rabbit fur is one of those things like marabou that's just magical. There's something about it that just the way it moves in the water drives fish crazy. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, I'm going to hit this with some UV resin on the head. Right. Using Loon UV Flow. You could use Soul Res Bone Dry. I just happen to have a thing of Loon Flow at hand. I know a lot of people like the Soul Res Bone Dry. I haven't had a chance to try it yet. I'm going to give it a shot. It seems to be very, very popular. All right, I've done that. And I got a little bit of thread hanging off here. Again, does fish care if I trim this up? No. I care. We care, don't we? And now I'm going to come in and reinforce it back here with some UV resin. Hit it with that real quick. All right. And you see, I can tie these really fast. I can crank these out because I'm going to take a box full of them. When I get home, on most days of doing this, I'm going to have lost like 10 of these because there's just a lot of snags and logs in these rivers, and you're going to get hung up. It's just the nature of the fishing. It's not clear water. You have a really hard time seeing what's on the bottom, and so you get hung up. A lot of wood in there. So now that that's all treated, once you get that thing in the water, you will see some really nice swimmy action on this back part here. Swung across the current or stripped, doesn't matter. When they're really aggressive, they'll come after it stripped. When they're not feeling quite so aggressive, I'm swinging it just like I'm fishing for steelhead, swinging across the current, you know, putting it right in their face, and they'll hit it. So that's the stupid simple Zonker. Chartreuse, it ain't no use. If it ain't chartreuse, it ain't no use. Lefty Cray edition there. So thank y'all. This is just, and I'm just got a new GoPro here, so I'm trying it out. See how it does for fly tying videos. It doesn't have super zoom in capabilities, but it's good enough.